to begin? Okay, all right. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all very much for joining us today for this press conference with the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Venezuela. Joining us today are all three members of the commission. In the center, the chair, Marta Valinas. To my right is Francisco Cox-Vial, and on the far right is Patricia Tapata. The mission will be sharing with you the findings of their latest report, which is on the mission's website or will be shortly, along with two more reports known as conference room papers that contain more detailed findings. A press release on today's report has been sent out and should be with you in your inboxes. The mission will be presenting this report to the Human Rights Council at the start of next week on Monday, 25th of September, which will be followed by an interactive dialogue. As you may know, the fact-finding mission was created in 2019 by the Human Rights Council. It has a mandate to investigate gross violations of human rights, including extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention, torture, and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, including those involving sexual and gender-based violence committed since 2014. And to help combat impunity and ensure accountability for perpetrators, justice for victims. So now Ms. Valinas will make an opening statement followed by remarks from the fellow experts. And then as usual, we'll open the floor to your questions. Now without further ado, I give the floor to Marta. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Todd. And I'd like to thank all the journalists in Geneva and worldwide for attending this media conference, online or in person. The Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela was established in 2019 and is today releasing its fourth report. We are focusing on several aspects of the country's human rights crisis. On the one hand, our report focuses on the different repressive mechanisms employed by the state apparatus against persons who are critical of the government and the impact of repression on the civic and democratic space in the country. On the other hand, we have expanded our investigations into state structures involved in the commission of human rights violations. The mission based its findings on 256 confidential interviews and focus groups discussions involving a total of 299 individuals, 153 men, 142 women, and 4 persons of diverse gender identities. Due to a continued lack of access to Venezuelan territory, these interviews were conducted remotely using security protocols. I will begin by addressing the first topic in our report. In our first report, published in 2020, we identified that the state authorities were responsible for gross human rights violations and international crimes as part of a policy to repress dissent against the government of President Maduro. We documented numerous instances of arbitrary deprivations of life, particularly in the context of peak periods of protests in 2014, 2017, and 2019, as well as mass arbitrary detentions followed by torture and ill treatment, sexual and gender-based violence, and also short-term enforced disappearances. In our first report, we concluded that many of these acts were crimes against humanity. The report that we have now prepared for the Human Rights Council provides an overview of how these human rights violations and international crimes have evolved since our first report. For this reason, the present report focuses on the period from 1st of January 2020 to 31st of August 2023. For the purposes of this update, we investigated 43 new cases involving the human rights violations and crimes explicitly listed in our mandate. These cases concerned 72 individual victims, of whom 47 were men, 25 were women, including 1 transgender woman. We have only investigated these violations and crimes where they were clearly linked to the state's policy of targeting real or perceived opponents to the Maduro government. We concluded that at least 58 individuals were arbitrarily detained in Venezuela in the period from 2020 to the present. And these cases include the arbitrary detention of trade union leaders, human rights defenders, NGO members, journalists, members of opposition parties, and others who expressed criticism or complaints against the government, including labor demands. We also found that at least 14 individuals were subjected to short-term enforced disappearances attributable to state authorities. The victims remained missing for periods between several hours to several days and up to 10 days, until the authorities eventually disclosed their whereabouts, having first denied such information to their relatives or lawyers. In addition, we documented 28 cases of torture and ill treatment against individuals who opposed the government or are perceived as such, while they were being held in detention, both in official and clandestine places of detention. Sexual and gender-based violence continue to be used as a form of torture and humiliation through rape, the threat of rape, as well as through invasive searches and forced nudity against detainees and even against their family members and lawyers when they visit them in prison. Overall, we received fewer allegations of the human rights violations and crimes explicitly listed in our mandate as compared to those documented in previous reports. But we wish to emphasize that the numbers recorded in this year's report must be viewed in light of a shift in the political and human rights crisis in Venezuela that took place in late 2020 and early 2021. The year 2020, with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, marked the end of massive protests called for by opposition parties, also a reduction in the practice of massive arrests of demonstrators, followed by torture and detention, and also the end of large-scale counterinsurgency operations deployed by state forces in response to initiatives to overthrow or destabilize the government. Our conclusion is that serious human rights violations are being committed to this day in Venezuela, and that these violations are not isolated acts, but continue to reflect a policy to suppress dissent and opposition to the government. The mission has reasonable grounds to believe that state security forces, such as the General Directorate of Military Counterintelligence, the Bolivarian National Intelligence Service, the National Bolivarian Police, have continued to be responsible for the violations that I have just described.
This year, in addition to the hardline tactics of repression that Ms. Valinas referred to, we decided to extend the scope of our investigations to look at other coercive methods to control, silence, and repress criticism or even questioning of the government, the so-called softer methods of repression. For this purpose, we documented numerous cases of targeted repression of union leaders, journalists, human rights defenders, politicians, and their family members, as well as repression of key civil society institutions, political parties, and the media. The cases involved 51 individual victims. We also investigate 42 instances of attacks and restrictions against civil society organizations and political parties. Our investigation has shown that civil society leaders and journalists have been targeted through surveillance and threats, as well as defamatory campaigns by high-level government officials. Arbitrary criminal proceedings have been used to make examples of outspoken critics, charging them with crime, such as hate speech or terrorism, simply for organizing peaceful demonstration or protests, publicly questioning members of the government. State institutions have banned candidates from opposition parties from running for public office. We found that due to state controls, there is almost no independent print media in the country. The government also censors content published on television, radio, and web pages. Media outlets who disregard censorship face arbitrary closures, which has led to increasing self-censorship. The coverage of topics regarding human rights violation or anti-government demonstration is banned. It is expected that, as in the past, the coverage of this press conference will be probably censored by the authorities. The government also uses laws and regulation to limit the operations of NGOs, labor unions, and political parties, imposing state-selected boards of directors on these organizations to control their activities. Despite Venezuela's historical advocacy for women's rights, activists and organizations working in the field of sexual and reproductive rights are facing intensified harassment, often from government factions influenced by ultra-conservative religious groups. By criminalizing participation in legitimate activities, the government is silencing and creating a chilling effect on anyone who might consider participating in any activity that could be perceived as critical of the government. In addition, the lack of independence and the deliberate action of judicial and constitutional institutions, including the Comptroller General, the Ombudsman Office, and the National Electoral Council, contribute to curtailing the civic and democratic space. We are witnessing signs that the selective repression against social and political leaders is intensifying in light of the forthcoming presidential election scheduled for 2024. The recent political disqualification of opposition presidential nominee Maria Corina Machado, the judicial intervention by the Supreme Court of the Communist Party of Venezuela, or the criminal conviction of 6 prominent trade union leaders are worrying signs in this regard.
Thank you. One of the trademarks of this fact-finding mission on Venezuela's investigation is our focus on state structures involved in human rights violations. This focus is key in pursuing accountability for past atrocities and justice to victims and contributing to the prevention of future human rights violations and crimes. This year, we have focused our investigation on a new police structure created in July 2022, the Directorate for Strategic and Tactical Action, DAET for its Spanish acronym. Specifically, we looked at the allegations that the new directorate is simply a reproduction of the previous Special Action Forces, FAES for its Spanish acronym. This is an area of particular concern for the mission. According to our first report, the Special Action Forces ranked among the most lethal police force in Venezuela, notably through their involvement in security operations aimed at combating criminality. We concluded that the FAES were involved in extrajudicial killings, including crimes against humanity. The mission also documented their involvement in arbitrary detention of real or perceived opponents of the government, who were subsequently handed over to and tortured by the state intelligence services. The Special Action Forces were supposedly disbanded in mid-2022, and the new structure, the Directorate for Strategic and Tactical Actions, or DAET, was established formally in July 2022. Through our investigations, we have obtained testimonies and documents from sources with inside knowledge of the structure, organization, modus operandi, and chain of command of this directorate, which we have corroborated with other information from official and open sources. This allows us to conclude that the DAET is the de facto continuation of the FAES. Indeed, in terms of its structure and organization, the DAET has absorbed personnel and police units that were part of the FAES. Regarding its modus operandi, we analyzed the role of the DAET's intervention in the so-called Thunder Security Operations, or Operaciones Trueno, Between April and September 2022, according to open sources, these operations resulted in 72 killings and 345 arrests. The DAET participated in 5 out of 7 of these operations, replicating actions and strategies from FAES used in previous security operations. For example, it was reported that security agents carried out raids without warrant and performed arbitrary detentions, that they killed people on the basis that they had criminal records, and that in some cases, the victims did not confront security forces before they were directly executed. In relation to the chain of command, we found that out of the 15 command and middle management positions in DAET, 10 have been held by former high-ranking officials of the now extinct FAES. Some of them were identified in our previous reports as responsible for international crimes, including the director of DAET, the former director, and the head of the Criminal Investigations Division. Our investigations have led us to conclude that security agencies involved in serious human rights violations and crimes against humanity continue to exist in Venezuela, only to have the names of the agency changed. Meanwhile, the government condecorates, promotes, and entrusts new command responsibilities to those who should be prosecuted and sanctioned. Allow me to conclude some final reflections. Our investigations have built up a picture of the hard-line and softer tactics of repression deployed in Venezuela against real or perceived opponents of the government. These are two components of an oppressive state apparatus that has been used at varying degrees depending on the nature and perceived influence of social dissent. But the important point is that the state continues to have the capacity to resort to the hardline tactics, and then they can activate or deactivate this method at will. What we are witnessing now is an accumulated impact of these tactics of repression, which has a result in a prevalent culture of fear, mistrust, and self-censorship. As a consequence, the fundamental elements of civic and democratic space have been severely curtailed in Venezuela. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for those opening remarks. So today's press conference will be taking place in English only. However, if you would like to ask questions in Spanish or interview one of the experts in Spanish, please contact me and we'll arrange that after the press conference is over. We'll now open the floor to questions. If I could ask you to introduce yourself and your organization before posing your query. Please go ahead in the front row.
Thank you. I am Antonio Broto, journalist for FS Spanish News Agency. You mentioned that some commanders of FAES have been promoted after this force was converted into DAET. Can you give us some examples? Also, people condecorated and that were thanked for its work with FAES. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. Yes, indeed, one of the findings from our investigations into this new directorate that was created within the National Bolivarian Police in Venezuela, the DAET, is that indeed a high number of those in leadership positions within this directorate, so 10, in fact, 9 out of these leadership positions, 9 out of 14 individuals had been previously members of the Special Action Forces, which, as my colleague Francisco mentioned, we had identified in previous reports that had been, the Special Action Forces had been involved in the commission of serious international crimes and gross human rights violations. Out of those 9 that I just mentioned, in particular, three of them that had been identified in previous reports of the mission. And those are José Miguel Domínguez Ramírez, Carlos Alberto Calderón Chirinos, and Ronnie González Montesinos, are individuals that previously were part of the either the Special Action Forces or SEBIN, which is the National Intelligence Service. And in those posts, the mission has reasonable grounds to believe that they were involved in gross human rights violations and serious international crimes, including acts of torture and other forms of ill treatment. Now, these individuals in this new directorate, the DAET, have taken up important positions. José Miguel Domínguez Ramírez has been the director of this new directorate, the DAET. Carlos Alberto Calderón Chirinos was formerly the deputy director of DAET and is currently the director. And Ronnie González Montesinos is the chief of the Criminal Investigations Division of DAET. That is why not only are we reporting about a continuity in terms of the chain of command between the Special Action Forces, the FIs, and this new Directorate of Strategic and Tactical Actions, the DAET, but also that key individuals in state structures such as the FIs, the Special Action Forces, and the SEBIN, the National Intelligence Service, have taken up important positions in this new directorate, instead of what the mission had recommended, that they would be investigated for their involvement in previous gross human rights violations and international crimes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take another question. Any more from the room? We'll take one question online from Maria Alejandra. If you could just identify what news agency you're working with. Go ahead.
Yes, Maria Alejandra Isteguieta. Thank you. Yes, I'm Maria Alejandra Isteguieta for El Nacional from Venezuela. I wanted to ask the experts, they've mentioned that they have identified serious international crimes and its perpetrators, as Ms. Valinas just explained in more detail. I was wondering, have you shared this information with the ICC's Office of the Prosecutor, given that they are carrying out an international criminal investigation on Venezuela, or with any other organization that might be able to take legal actions under the universal jurisdiction, as you had suggested in your first report? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. The mission has mentioned several times previously that the information that we collect, be it through the interviews that we conduct or documentary evidence, provided that the sources have given us authorization to share this information with other jurisdictions and other organizations, and in particular jurisdictions that respect due process, the mission is willing and pleased to share that information. That includes, of course, International Criminal Court for their current investigations into the situation in Venezuela, as well as other jurisdictions that may be analyzing these human rights violations and crimes under the principle of universal jurisdiction. So we are willing to do that. We are ready to do that. And we congratulate, in fact, initiatives under the principle of universal jurisdiction that attempt to promote accountability for the crimes and violations that have been documented by the mission. including the current initiative of the Clooney Foundation for Justice in Argentina, but others that may come up in the future. And we, of course, also are accompanying with great interest the developments in the investigation of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take another question online from Laurent Sierro from the Swiss News Agency.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. In previous reports, you were calling explicitly for the dismantling of FAES. And it's interesting to see that in this report, you're just calling for reforms of DAET. Does that mean that you don't believe anymore that the authorities are going to be willing to take that step and to dismantle that kind of unit within the police? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. We believe that they must comply with human rights, international human rights standards. And since what we've seen is that there's no prosecution and sanction of those most responsible of the crimes that we have been reporting in previous reports, and we see a similar modus operandi and a kind of like condecoration and change of name only, we believe that, of course, dismantling would be an option, but this is the minimal. I mean, you must prosecute and sanction and investigate those that we have mentioned as, with reasonable grounds to believe, as involved in these crimes in our previous reports. Therefore, of course, our recommendation is basically the same, but to uplift and respect human rights standards and prosecute, because these are crimes under Venezuelan criminal law.
I would just add that what our investigations show as well is that in certain contexts, as we have seen in Venezuela, disbanding or officially disbanding a certain structure, such as the Special Action Forces, doesn't always and doesn't necessarily solve the problem, right? That's exactly what we've seen, and that's exactly what we are highlighting here, is that an official disbanding of a certain structure actually meant that key individuals from that structure were transferred to another structure. And we have seen as well that practices have also been replicated in this new structure. Of course, this new structure was created only a little bit over a year ago. So we will need more time also to investigate, and that's why it's important to monitor the actions of this new force. But we have already documented, for example, one case of a union leader who was arbitrarily detained and subjected to ill treatment by this new directorate. So, as Francisco says, it is important to ensure accountability through investigation and prosecution of individuals that have been involved in these crimes, but it is essential to ensure that practices are changed within these institutions. And not just the disbanding of one structure to for it to transform into another structure, as has been the case here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take another question online from Regina Garcia.
Thank you. Good morning. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Regina Garcia with Associated Press. I have a couple of questions. You mentioned in your remarks, as well as in the report, this shift from broad to more targeted repression over the past 3 years. As you know, the opposition's primary election is just in a little over a month. And I'm wondering, do you expect some of these strategies that you mentioned to intensify over the next few weeks? And also, as you know, electoral conditions are part of some of the broader negotiations involving Venezuela and other countries. And I'm wondering if you're concerned that some of this, I guess, not just the shift, but also the continuation of this targeted repression is perhaps been minimized in an effort to move some of those negotiations along. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you also for your question. What we have documented is indeed that some of the restrictions on civic and democratic space, such as limitations to the work of the media and to political parties and political nominees, has intensified even in the past, in periods before elections. And so based on what happened in the past, we could say that it is indeed to be expected. In fact, some of these acts we are seeing already an intensification right now. So for example, almost 300 radio stations were closed in the country in the period between 2003 and 2022. Now, out of this period, 2022 was the year that registered a higher number of radio stations being closed. As you know, and has already been mentioned, we have three nominees to the primary elections of from the unitary platform of the opposition parties that have been politically disqualified, and one just recently, Maria Corina Machado. So on the basis of what we've documented in the past, in terms of limitations of the work of the media and of individual journalists, but also restrictions on political parties and political disqualification of individual nominees, we have alarming signs in terms of what is currently and what can be in the coming months the reality in terms of the civic and democratic space of what should be a free civic and democratic space in Venezuela. We don't like to speculate too much. We'd rather share with you what we've reported in the past, but we will definitely be paying close attention to what will be happening in the coming months and in the coming year until the upcoming elections.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's really important, and this is, if you read the whole report, what we're reporting here and what we're concluding is that there's like a two-way repression or two components of the state apparatus that is oppressive and that has an effect on public and democratic civic space. And this is the more targeted, hard line, the core of our mandate, that it's explicit in our mandate, that is more targeted. And as Marta and Patricia were mentioning, you see leaders in certain sections of society that are still being arbitrarily detained and submitted to torture. This sends the signal to civil society that if you get involved, you suffer these consequences. And this is built on what had happened before that was less targeted. If you see this in addition to this more soft line, quote unquote, repression, done through CONATEL, done through the Electoral National Council, done through the judiciary, that they take over political parties that even were part of these closer to the government parties like the Communist Party, that now is intervened by the judiciary. You see that there is a restriction in political and democratic space. The disqualification of those opposition members that start to raise in the polls, like Ms. Machado, Corina Machado, right? And so this, of course, is not the best atmosphere to have an election. But as Marta was saying, we report and we have one last year of mandate, and we'll be paying attention on exactly what happens to these modes of repression that we have seen and documented in this current report.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take a, yes. Oh, please go ahead, sorry.
Just to say something more in regarding this last point, I think that this is very important to figure out how these actions are clearly oriented at deterring critics of the opponent. Indeed, they serve as a flagship or emblematic cases to silence and crush the will to speak freely. Even if they were not, there are a number of actions that appear to be perfectly combined, concerted, using the political institutionality of the state. If you remember, we mentioned the Ombudsman Office, the Controller, and the National Council for Elections. All these institutions and others of administrative levels put permanent administrative obstacles for the registration and for daily functioning of the NGOs and political parties, and more. For example, the intervention of the government changing the board of directors of those institutions is a clear demonstration of the direction of these measures. If the states intervene in any step of civil society and political parties' daily life, it's very difficult to see a not worrying environment when we are experience a pre-electoral time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. Okay, we'll take one more question online and then we'll come back to the room. We have Gabriela Sotomayor. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for taking my question. This is Gabriela Sotomayor, Proceso, Mexico. I have several questions, if may I. First, regarding all of you that you are saying about elections and everything, do you fear that Venezuela is heading towards a dictatorship, or is it already de facto dictatorship? I just want to know that. Then, do you think that perpetrators of these serious violations of human rights that you are mentioning, that you are describing, do you think that the perpetrators are acting with the Nicolás Maduro consent? And then another question on María Corina Machado. Did you contact her? Do you fear for her life or her security? Because, Nicolás Maduro said that she can't run for elections, and the people support her a lot. So what are your observations on this? And lastly, if by any chance you can give a message in Spanish later with the main findings, because it's important to listen to you in Spanish. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriela. We highlighted in our report several attacks on the civic and democratic space in Venezuela. We will not comment on the political nature of the current government. That is not our mandate. Our mandate is to document, as we've done, specific human rights violations, and this includes violations to freedom of expression, freedom of association, and also the right to participate in public affairs, which includes the so-called political rights. And that's in that framework that we've analyzed as well how or to what extent the rights to participate in political life are being respected or not, and that is why we are documenting cases of interference and arbitrary employment of political disqualifications, for example. But what we are analyzing is really how those fundamental freedoms and rights are being respected in the country, rather than going into a political assessment of the current government, which is beyond the scope of our mandate. In terms of the crimes and violations that the mission has documented, as you know very well, some of the crimes and violations that we've documented in the past, and we've documented at length the involvement of higher levels of within the state in terms of their knowledge and contribution to the commission of those crimes. That has been documented extensively in our past reports, and this refers primarily to the violations and international crimes that we've documented in our report of 2020, and then elaborated further in the following reports in 2021 and 2022, which correspond to the period in which we are saying now that the more violent tactics or hardline tactics were used by the state to repress dissidents and criticism and opposition to the government. So in relation to those crimes that we've documented in the past, I think that's quite clearly established from our view, and on the basis of reasonable grounds to believe that there was knowledge and contribution from higher levels of the government and other state institutions. Now, in terms of certain individuals with public profiles, such as Maria Corina Machado, but others as well, fearing for their lives and their security, we have also noted throughout our investigations that on the one hand, those that stay in the country and that are perceived or are in fact opponents to the government are subject to a number of attacks. Sometimes we're talking about physical attacks. We've documented cases of arbitrary detentions of both members of the political opposition parties, but prominent members of civil society more in general. So human rights defenders, people who are criticizing the policies and decisions of the government, or sometimes omissions of the government. We've documented several types of attacks on their integrity, their liberty, and also on freedom of expression and freedom of participation in political public affairs. And we've noted that some of these individuals have had to leave the country precisely because of their fear for their lives and for reasons of insecurity. And this, again, includes both members of political parties, but also individuals that have simply done their work as human rights defenders, including individuals that work on, as Patricia mentioned before, on sexual and reproductive rights that go against the line of the government and therefore start being harassed, start being followed, are subject to discrediting, stigmatizing, defamatory messages in public media and other fora that are used by state officials. And so there is clearly a threat on integrity and right to security of these individuals. And that's why many of them do leave the country and receive protection based on their well-founded fears of political persecution. So yes, I think that is a concern for many individuals who are still in the country, and that has led many of others to leave the country in the past years and currently still. I'll hand over to one of my colleagues for a summary. If I understood, you'd like that to be done now, a summary in Spanish of the findings. Gabriela. No? Okay.
Just very short and in reference to a portion of the question. The FFM is not interested and is not able also because of it's out of our mandate to qualify the nature of the political regime. Perhaps you can look to this in some political science manuals. But we envision that if things continue to happen in this way, and for example, we know because some inhabilitations are hidden now, but will be announced at the time of the Electoral Act or more, will be announced when the person running for election win. These are not a good and fair condition to an electoral competition. So right now, we have to focus in, for example, remember that 2 candidates are not able to run for this election, that is Caprile and Freddy Superlano, and 1 person nominee as Maria Corina Machado is also with not able to run because of the announcement of the Cámara Electoral. But it's very important to remember that there are many, many people of lower levels, but not all the inhabilitations are known by the public, less, nor all the inhabilitations are publicly in a formal newsletter or other source, official source from the government.
I don't know if in Spanish, as he asked, just...
It's okay. Sure,
brief,
please go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. La misión tiene motivos razonables para creer que los demás mecanismos de represión documentados en el capítulo 4 de este informe contribuyen a la política del Estado de silenciar, desalentar y sofocar la oposición real o percibida al gobierno del presidente Maduro. Las investigaciones de la misión han permitido construir un panorama de los métodos de represión, entre comillas, duros y blandos, desplegados en la República Bolivariana de Venezuela, contra opositores reales o percibidos como tales. Se trata de 2 componentes de un aparato opresivo del Estado que se ha utilizado en diversos grados, dependiendo de la naturaleza de la disidencia social y de la percepción de su influencia. Por un lado, durante el período anterior de protestas populares masivas en las calles venezolanas, entre el 2014 y el 2019, las tácticas en mano dura más violentas se utilizaron activamente para silenciar las voces de la oposición a cualquier precio, incluso mediante la comisión de delitos. Por otro lado, el uso por parte del Estado de tácticas coercitivas más suaves, aunque presentes anteriormente, se ha vuelto más recurrente en los últimos años. El uso por parte del Estado de su aparato opresivo se ha vuelto más selectivo debido en parte al efecto inhibitorio de sus anteriores esfuerzos para anular la disidencia, al escrutinio internacional de violación de las violaciones cometidas en el pasado, así como el hecho de que muchas personas huyeron del país por temor fundado a ser perseguidas por motivos políticos. Sin embargo, el uso de mecanismos de represión más suaves, entre comillas, se ve respaldado por la amenaza latente de que el Estado puede recurrir en cualquier momento a mecanismos más duros que el gobierno puede activar o desactivar a voluntad, como así lo ha hecho. Muchas gracias.
Okay, we'll go back to Efe in the front.
Thank you very much. I think this report mentions less government leaders than previous documents, but one which is still mentioned is Diosdado Cabello. Can you elaborate on his role, silencing dissent? I think it's an example of the soft measures that you are calling in this report, but is he also behind harder measures? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. We have indeed in this report focused, as we said in the beginning, mostly on attacks on civic and democratic space in Venezuela, which complement, let's say, exist in parallel with other harsher forms of repression that we've documented at length before and to which we provide an update in this report. Now, in terms of the involvement of state officials and state institutions in what we're documenting in this report as attacks on civic and democratic space, we highlight in several areas of the report how statements and particularly defamatory or disqualifying, stigmatizing statements by state officials, including Diosdado Cabello, who, as you know, is a member of the National Assembly and is the vice president of the ruling party in Venezuela. The fact that individuals like him use state media, but also other platforms, including the National Assembly itself, to make this type of statements that I just mentioned. And the seriousness of this type of statements is also linked to what you mentioned, which is the fact that we've documented previously that certain of these individuals have, in particular cases where, for example, certain individuals were arbitrarily arrested, they have made also statements, for example, in relation to their innocence. So by even before the courts had a chance to analyze the cases, they were already saying also in state media and in their public platforms that these individuals were guilty, and usually the type of accusations made are that they are guilty of terrorism, of conspiracy, of being traitors to the nation. And all of this has, as we found, an impact, of course, on the ability of these individuals to really carry out their work, be it as human rights defenders, as journalists, or as members of political parties. Because on the one hand, it impacts the image, of course, that large parts of the population have of these individuals, but also carries that threat that someone like him accusing someone of being a traitor or of being a terrorist because they are in contact with foreign governments or receiving funding from foreign governments carries the threat that there will be indeed judicial proceedings against that person, as has happened in the past. So the importance, the relevance, and the alarming nature of this type of statements and expressions by individuals with that level of power is because it has happened in the past that when they've identified someone in these terms, as traitor, terrorist, or involved in conspiracies against the government, has resulted in detentions and in sometimes prolonged pre-trial periods and in judicial proceedings where we've documented that due process was not respected. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Okay, we'll go back to follow-up from Maria Alejandra from El Nacional.
Thank you very much. Yes, I wanted to touch upon the banning that our experts referred on, the banning of running in elections. Have you been able to speak to the Venezuelan authorities with regards to the legality of these bannings of candidates that you pointed out in the report and right now in the press conference? And then I had a second question, and it's with regards with the collaborators of the political parties in the different cities. When candidates go to events and rallies around the country, they have those that have helped them are later on harassed, or their shops are being closed, or they are even detained. And I was wondering if you had been able to document any of these cases, if you had testimonies or information in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Responding to your first question, whether we've been able to discuss with authorities, and if I understood well, you mentioned specifically on the issue of political disqualifications. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to discuss any of the issues that we've documented with representatives of the Venezuelan state and several state institutions that we mention in our report. And the reason for that is that the Venezuelan state has chosen not to respond to any of our attempts to engage in dialogue or requests for information, for specific information. That is unfortunate, and that is something that we would want to be different in the future, so that we can also include information, official information, as well as their point of view in our reports. We have documented several instances in which individuals that are that are helping or working together in some way with the main individuals targeted end up suffering also several types of attacks or limitations on their capacity to do their work. So I think you also, in your question, you made reference specifically also to political candidates, so I'll focus on that as well in my answer. And we have documented how in several instances when political candidates were doing their work throughout the country and going to public meetings in different parts of the country, they were faced with, for example, hotels where they were staying at being actually closed, either the following day or even before they were able to stay there. Also, several checkpoints during their route to the places where they were having these public gatherings. And all of this hampering their capacity to actually do their work. But more than that, we've also documented cases where individuals that are sometimes the drivers, I mean relatives as well, but sometimes drivers, etc., of the individuals that are seen as the opponents to the government and who are the principal targets, also being arbitrarily arrested, also spending long periods in pretrial detention, and so suffering also in that way because of being associated with the principal targets of the repression. Thank you.
I would just add that to all that Marta has said, that you can find all that analysis in chapter 3 of our longer report, but also that some of the interference that we see by the telecommunications, National Telecommunications Commission, is by censorship, and that some people cannot be interviewed, some words cannot be said, and as soon as they interview or interact with these people, they risk the continuity of this radio or newspaper, internet newspaper. So there is a different modes of harassment that follow when you breach these censorship rules. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one last question from Carmen Lucia and from El Timpio in Colombia.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking my question and for this briefing, of course. I just wanted to know if we can have a copy of your opening remarks, please. Thank you.
Yes, that's possible. And also you have, of course, the press release and our reports, which I strongly encourage you to read, the short reports in both languages, English and Spanish, which I think give you a lot of information, very complete information for your reporting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Would any of the experts like to make any final comments before we close? Okay, all right. Well, that brings us to the end of this press conference today. The main report is online already, and the two detailed reports will be, two additional detailed reports will be online shortly. We're working on that. And if you need them, just please write to us and we'll get them to you. Thank you. Have a good day.